a framework agreement with Huawei Technologies to deploy 5G infrastructure across 17 of the country's 23 provinces. Not with Qualcomm, not with Ericsson, not with Nokia, with Huawei. The same company that the United States Congress formally designated a national security threat in 2019, the same company that the Federal Communications Commission banned from American telecommunications networks in 2020. Argentina just handed them the keys to one of Latin America's largest digital economies, and the implications for American technology leadership, American workers, or American strategic interests in the Western Hemisphere are serious, far-reaching, and almost entirely absent from the mainstream conversation. Let that sink in. Argentina represents a $19 billion telecommunications market. That is not a rounding error. That is not a secondary concern. Qualcomm, the San Diego-based semiconductor company that employs approximately 50,000 people globally and has been the dominant supplier of mobile chipsets and 5G licensing revenue across Latin America for the better part of a decade, just watched a foundational market agreement evaporate. Qualcomm's 5G intellectual property licensing generates roughly $9.40 per device in standard royalty fees. Multiply that across a projected 47 million 5G-enabled devices in Argentina by 2030, according to GSMA Intelligence's most recent regional forecast. And you begin to understand the magnitude of what changed last Wednesday. Nobody in Washington is talking about this at the volume it deserves. The announcement came with very little fanfare. There was no press conference with major American networks broadcasting live. There was no emergency session of the Senate Commerce Committee. There was one brief mention in the Financial Times, a somewhat longer analysis piece in the South China Morning Post, and near total silence from the cable news networks that spend most of their airtime on domestic political theater. But here, the facts deserve full examination, because what happened in Buenos Aires last week is not simply a business story. It is a geopolitical signal, an economic warning, and a very uncomfortable question about whether American foreign policy in Latin America is equal to the challenges of this decade. Argentina is the second largest economy in South America. Its GDP stood at approximately $640 billion in 2025, according to World Bank data. Its population of 46 million people represents one of the most educated and digitally active populations in the developing world, with smartphone penetration already exceeding 87%. When a country like Argentina makes a 5G infrastructure decision, it is not simply choosing an antenna vendor, it is choosing a data architecture, an equipment standard, a supply chain, and by extension, an economic partner for the next 20 to 30 years. That is not hyperbole. That is how telecommunications infrastructure works. And it is worth pausing here to ask how this came to pass. Because this did not happen in a vacuum. If you have found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Independent analysis of the stories that matter to American interests depends on an engaged and informed audience. Now back to what actually happened. The story begins, as so many stories of American strategic drift begin, with a gap between stated commitment and actual investment. The United States government, through the Development Finance Corporation, pledged in 2021 to counter Chinese telecommunications infrastructure investment in Latin America with what officials called a credible alternative. That pledge materialized in the form of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, announced at the G7 summit in June 2022. President Biden stood alongside allied leaders and committed to mobilizing $600 billion in global infrastructure investment by 2027. Here is where the numbers don't lie. As of December 2025, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment had committed approximately $60 billion in total across all sectors globally, according to a Brookings Institution review published in January 2026. Not $600 billion, $60 billion, 10% of the announced target, and of that $60 billion, less than $8 billion went toward telecommunications-specific projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. China's BRI digital infrastructure investments in Latin America over the same period exceeded $23 billion, according to the Boston University Global Development Policy Center's annual tracking report. The comparison is stark. Meanwhile, between 2019 and 2025, Huawei alone invested $3.2 billion in local partnerships, training programs, and government relationship building across Latin America, according to figures compiled by the Inter-American Dialogue. They trained over 140,000 local engineers and technicians across the region. They established research and development centers in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina itself. They showed up, consistently, at every level, from national ministers to municipal administrators to university engineering departments. And what did the United States offer Argentina during this same period? Argentina applied for IMF assistance in 2022, seeking relief from a debt crisis that had been building for years. The negotiations were grueling, the conditionality was strict, and the economic pain imposed on ordinary Argentines was severe. The IMF, in which the United States holds by far the largest voting share at approximately 17.4%, approved a $44 billion program structured around austerity measures that contributed to annual inflation rates exceeding 211% by December 2023, the highest in the world at that time. Argentines were watching their savings evaporate while American-backed institutions delivered structural adjustment programs. And on the other side of the equation, China was offering fiber optic cable, 5G towers, job training, and long-term investment with no public lectures about fiscal discipline. This is not a defense of Chinese strategic interests. This is an honest accounting of how strategic ground gets lost. Here is what nobody is talking about in the breathless coverage that this story is not actually receiving. Argentina's 5G decision is not just about Argentina. It is about the data architecture of the entire southern cone, and what happens when Ecuador, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay look at this moment and ask which partner showed up, which partner invested, and which partner delivered results rather than promises. And folks, this is where it gets really concerning. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee's Technology Subpanel, warned in February 2026 during a Council on Foreign Relations session that Huawei's 5G infrastructure creates what he described as, and this is a paraphrase of his publicly reported remarks, structural data access vulnerabilities that cannot be patched after deployment. That once a Huawei 5G core network is operational, the architecture of that network creates persistent intelligence collection opportunities that alternative vendors simply do not. This is not a partisan observation. Senator Warner's assessment aligns with findings published by the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity in September 2025, which documented specific technical concerns about high-risk vendors in core network functions. What that means in practical terms for American interests is this. Argentina is a member of Mercosur. Argentina conducts trade and military cooperation agreements with Brazil, with Chile, with Uruguay. American military commands in the region depend on intelligence sharing and communications infrastructure, interoperability with partner nations. When the foundational telecommunications architecture of a major partner nation operates on hardware and software developed by a company that United States law designates a national security concern, the implications extend far beyond royalty payments to Qualcomm. Dr. Evan Ellis, a professor at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute and one of the most cited scholars of Chinese influence in Latin America, published an analysis in February 2026 in the journal Orbis, noting that Chinese digital infrastructure investments in the Western Hemisphere have moved, in his assessment, from competitive to structurally entrenching. His argument, drawn from fieldwork across 8 Latin American countries, is that the combination of subsidized equipment, local workforce development, and government-to-government financing creates what he calls a lock-in dynamic that makes future vendor transitions economically prohibitive for recipient nations. The numbers behind that lock-in dynamic are instructive. According to a 2025 study by the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, the average cost for a mid-sized developing nation to rip and replace Chinese telecommunications infrastructure with alternative vendors runs between 40% and 60% of the original installation cost. For Argentina, with 17 provinces now entering Huawei 5G agreements, that replacement cost could reach between $7, $6 billion and $11. $4 billion by the time full deployment is complete, based on regional infrastructure cost models from the World Bank's Digital Development Partnership. Once built, it will not be replaced. That is the operational reality. I want to be clear about something. The criticism here is not of Argentina's government, whatever its political complexion. Nations make decisions in their strategic interest based on what partners are actually offering. Argentina needed infrastructure investment, economic partnership, and a path toward digital modernization that did not come with punishing conditionality. What was on offer from the American side and from the broader Western coalition fell short of what was needed, when it was needed. That is a failure of American strategic engagement, not a moral failing of Argentine leadership. But understanding how we arrived here does not reduce the consequences of where we are. For American workers in the semiconductor and telecommunications sector, the Argentina decision is one data point in a pattern that has material employment consequences. Qualcomm's licensing revenue losses from the Argentine market alone, projected over a 10-year horizon at conservative device adoption rates, represent between $440 million and $620 million in foregone royalty income, according to analyst estimates from Bernstein Research's telecommunications equity team. That is not abstract. That translates into research and development budget decisions. It translates into hiring decisions at Qualcomm's facilities in San Diego, in Raleigh, in Austin. Broadcom, which supplies network infrastructure components that compete with Huawei's integrated solutions, faces similar displacement risk. The company's most recent 10-K filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission identified Latin American market share erosion as a material risk factor, citing specifically the expansion of state-subsidized Chinese vendors. Intel, which had been positioning its network infrastructure division to compete for 5G open radio access network contracts in emerging markets, referenced comparable concerns in analyst briefings last November. These are publicly traded American companies with American employees and American shareholders. Their market position in Latin America is a measure of American industrial competitiveness. When that position erodes, it is not simply a corporate accounting matter. And then there is the broader developmental picture. The International Telecommunication Union estimated in its 2025 connectivity report that 35 million Argentines remain underserved by high-speed broadband access. The deployment of 5G infrastructure, regardless of vendor, will connect schools, hospitals, small businesses, and agricultural operations to digital services that transform economic productivity. That is genuinely important. Rural Argentine farmers gaining real-time market access, Argentine hospitals gaining telemedicine connectivity, Argentine students gaining broadband-enabled educational resources. These are real human goods. The question is not whether Argentina should have 5G infrastructure. The question is who builds it, who maintains it, whose equipment standards define the architecture, and whose intelligence services have structural access to the data flowing through it. Those questions have answers that matter to American strategic interests, and the current answers are not favorable. Here is the deeper pattern that deserves attention. Since 2019, according to tracking data published by the American Enterprise Institute's China Global Investment Tracker, Chinese entities have signed telecommunications infrastructure agreements in 14 Latin American and Caribbean nations. In the same period, American companies backed by American government financing have concluded major telecommunications infrastructure agreements in 4. The trajectory is not ambiguous. What does the United States need to do differently? The answer from analysts, former diplomats, and strategic affairs scholars is reasonably consistent, even across political lines. The Development Finance Corporation needs actual capitalization at levels that allow it to compete with Chinese state-backed financing. The Commerce Department's export promotion apparatus needs to actively facilitate American technology company engagement in emerging markets, rather than treating export control enforcement as the primary engagement mechanism. And American diplomatic missions need to treat telecommunications infrastructure decisions as the strategic priority events they actually are, not as secondary commercial matters to be handled by trade attachés. Former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger, who served under President Obama and President Trump and has become one of the most respected voices on American strategic competition policy, wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine's January 2026 issue that the United States continues to, in his words, field a checklist where China fields a strategy. The observation was specific to telecommunications infrastructure competition in developing economies. The checklist he described includes sanctioning Huawei, issuing policy statements, publishing clean network frameworks, and organizing diplomatic communiques. The strategy he described on the Chinese side includes financing, building, training, and maintaining relationships over decades. Checklists do not win strategic competitions. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you think the United States government is doing enough to maintain American technology leadership in Latin America. This community's perspective matters, and this channel reads every comment. Please subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually at stake. This is a story about more than one 5G contract in Argentina. This is a story about a pattern that has been developing for a decade and that requires a fundamentally different level of seriousness from American leadership than it has received. The American tradition in foreign engagement has never been isolationism from competition. From the Marshall Plan to USAID's foundational development work to the Peace Corps to the Export-Import Bank, Americans built institutions specifically designed to project partnership, investment, and shared prosperity as instruments of strategic influence. Not as charity, not as idealism divorced from interest, as the deliberate expression of a belief that nations connected to American economic and technological systems would remain within a sphere of mutual benefit and shared democratic values. That tradition was not perfect. It was frequently compromised by Cold War expediency, by corporate interests that conflicted with local development, by conditionality that sometimes served creditors more than communities. Those failures deserve honest acknowledgement. But the underlying principle that American engagement should build things, connect people, and create lasting relationships rather than simply restrict competitors was sound. It produced results. And somewhere in the last 2 decades, the emphasis shifted from building to restricting, from investing to sanctioning, from showing up to showing concern. Argentina did not choose Huawei because its leaders admire the Chinese Communist Party. Argentina chose Huawei because Huawei showed up with financing, with equipment, with training programs, with long-term commitments, and with a price that the Argentine government could afford while dealing with a debt crisis that American-backed institutions helped manage in ways that inflicted real pain on real people. That is not a reason to abandon competition. That is a reason to compete harder, more intelligently, and with the full weight of American industrial and diplomatic capacity behind it. The numbers don't lie. The strategic map of Latin American telecommunications infrastructure is being drawn right now, province by province, fiber by fiber, spectrum license by spectrum license. Once drawn, it will not easily be redrawn. The decisions being made in Buenos Aires, in Bogotá, in Lima, in Quito over the next 3 to 5 years will shape the digital architecture of the Western Hemisphere for the next generation. Whether American technology, American standards, and American values of open internet architecture and user privacy protection define that architecture, or whether a different set of standards and a different set of access privileges define it, depends on choices that American policymakers, American companies, and American citizens make in the very near term. This is not a story about being afraid of competition. Americans have never needed to fear fair competition. This is a story about demanding that American leaders bring the full force of American strategic capacity to a competition that is already underway and that requires genuine engagement, not rhetorical commitment followed by inadequate investment. The tradition of American leadership that this generation inherited was built by people who understood that strategic influence required strategic investment, who understood that you cannot lead with words alone when competitors are leading with cranes, cables, and capital, who understood that disappointed patriotism is not the same as defeated patriotism, that the appropriate response to watching American strategic position erode is not despair and not cynicism, but clear-eyed determination to do better, demand better, and hold leaders accountable to a standard worthy of what this country has always been capable of when it decided the stakes were real. The stakes are real. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on what American policy toward Latin America should look like in the 5G era. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of the strategic stories that shape American interests. Like this video if you believe more Americans need to hear what the numbers actually say, and share it, because this conversation is too important to leave to the people who are not having it.